finally got some reaction. We're trying a new mic tonight, so we may have a little bit of mic trouble, so just bear with us. I'm just going to talk as if nothing's happening because I have full trust in Danny tonight and that he will make it work. So we'll see how it goes tonight. Told you. It's just the way it goes, man. Just the way it goes. We'll get through this, don't worry. Well, we're glad you're here tonight. We are continuing our series of sermons called Messy Life. And Messy Life is where we look at Hebrews, I don't know why I'm in Ephesians. We look at Hebrews chapter 11, and we look at some of the heroes of faith that are listed there. But we go back and we look at the places where they fell short, where they fell into sin, and how they overcame it, and how God still used them. And the idea behind this is because so many of us, and so many of you guys that I've talked to go, I don't think God could use me, I've done this. Or I don't think God could use me because I've done that. How could God love me because of what's been in my life? Well, I want to show you the people that God chooses to use. And you will find out they're a lot more like us than they are true heroes of faith. And so that's the goal with this series. Next week, I'll be out of town, and Chris Bradford will be preaching for us. He's going to be preaching on the Apostle Peter. We're kind of going out of order. Peter was going to be later on, but Chris wanted to preach about Peter. So he will be preaching that next week, and then the week after that, we'll pick up on Moses. But tonight, we are going to be looking at specifically Jacob, but really the family of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And here's what it says in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 20. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, and he worshiped, leaning on top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, he was nearing the end of his life, mentioned the exodus of the Israelites, and gave instruction concerning his bones. So we have this family that's mentioned here, 3 generations. And here's what's interesting about this family. They are mentioned in the Hall of Faith. Obviously, Isaac was Abraham's son that we talked about last week. They were a family in the Hall of Faith, generations in the Hall of Faith. But here's the thing. This family was toxic. Very toxic. And in fact, I think that most of us here tonight probably have some toxicity in our family. If you have a sibling, I know you feel there's toxicity in your family because that's the way siblings are. Your sibling is always toxic. And that's the way it was with me growing up. I had a toxic sibling. Now, most of you know my sister in here. I love my sister. I'm not trying to come down on her. This is just an illustration for the point of the sermon. She wasn't super toxic, but she definitely had some toxic tendencies, okay? So, when we were younger, my sister was the golden child in my dad's eyes. Anybody have a sibling like that? Yeah, I see you all raising your hands. The golden child. If you didn't raise your hand, that's you, and we don't like you. No, I'm just teasing. We do like you. We love you. We're glad you're here. But we all had that sibling, right? And she was the golden child in my dad's eyes. But my sister always had this toxic trait of coming and poking me and prodding me and pushing my buttons until I would just explode and unleash this unrivaled rage upon her. And then I'm the one that gets in trouble. Right? And she goes skipping off to her room like, I wasn't me. Oh. And she just gets off scot-free. Right? She had this very toxic trait about that. She wasn't very toxic, but this trait was toxic. Well, this trait, as she grew older and got into middle school and high school, turned from just me to my mother. And my mom would tell her things to do, and my sister, like every young lady that's growing up who is 12 or 13 going on 27 or 28, they know everything, right? And so she would begin to berate my mother, begin to get in her face and yell. And it was everything my mom could do not to punch her daughter in the face. I've seen it. I've watched it happen. And so this became a normal problem in our household. And I would go to my dad. My mom would go to my dad and be like, hey, you need to do something about Candace. She doesn't listen to mom. Mom would say she doesn't listen to me. We're having problems with her. And he's like, not my little angel. There's no way that she could be like that, right? She had him wrapped around her little finger, like most of you ladies probably had your dad wrapped around your finger. And he wouldn't believe it. He wouldn't believe it. And it was just horrible. It was the worst because we couldn't get any relief. My mom and I became very good friends because we'd have to defend ourselves back to back from my sister. She hit us with these multi-prong attacks. But then one day, sweet, sweet justice. Sweet justice came. And my mom had asked me not to get involved because I was a very angry, frustrated, and sometimes violent human being when I was younger. And so she asked me not to get involved. And so my mom and sister had gotten into an argument, and my sister had backed my mom into a wall and was giving her the riot act just inches from her face, just wah, wah, wah. And my mom had put her hands on my sister's shoulders so that she wouldn't punch her. At least that's what she told me later. All right, and held her away. And I was like fuming. I was upset. And so finally I come out of my bedroom and I come storming down the hall, and our hallway went down, and then it went to our foyer and our entryway, and then they were just around the corner here. And as I got halfway through the hallway, my dad came in. Oh, finally. And this is not a joke, and you can ask my mom to back this up. My sister goes from, get on there, to, hi, Daddy. Like this sweet, innocent little thing, but it was too late. And sweet justice had finally arrived. And he saw what we had been telling him about, that he had a hard time believing. And then here's the thing. My father did his job. He put things back in place. He reestablished the authority that my mother had. He disciplined my sister. And he restored the balance as any good father should. But tonight we are going to look at a story where there was a toxic family. And there was a toxic problem. But it wasn't the siblings. It was the mom and the dad. And the father never stepped into the right place to set things back right. And it caused trouble for 3 generations. So for our story tonight, I'm going to do things a little bit different. I'm going to read a passage. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 27, and I'm going to be reading verses 14 through 25. But I need to give you a little bit of backstory, because tonight we're actually going to cover from chapter 25 to chapter 49. And so I'm going to tell you a lot of things and give you a lot of short stories as we go along, but have your Bibles open to Genesis chapter 27, verse 14. The background is this. It starts with Isaac, Abraham's son that we talked about last week, and his wife, Rebekah. They struggled to have children, all right? But God finally came to them and said, hey, you're going to have a child. And then God came specifically to Rebekah in verse 23, and he said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 people will come from you and be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So she was given this promise that she would give birth to twins, and she did. And she was given this promise that the older would serve the younger. She didn't know what that was yet, but we'll find out as we go along what that actually meant. So she has these twins. They are separated. The first one is the oldest, is Esau. He comes out and he grows up to be a manly man. He's like the dude of all dudes. He grows up, he's hairy, like a crazy, like we're going to find out how hairy he is in just a minute. It's nuts. He is super hairy, all right? He goes out and he hunts all the time. He lives his life out and about, and he is his father's favorite. He's dad's favorite, and these guys get along like 2 peas in a pod. The second out was Jacob. Jacob was not as hairy. He was not quite as big, although he was a normal man. But he was mom's favorite. He became a homebody. He loved to stay around and work with the animals and cook and clean. And he was a mama's boy, all right? There's nothing wrong with a good mama's boy. I was a mama's boy, all right? He was a mom's boy. And she had her favorite, and Isaac had his favorite. Well, in chapter 25, something comes along. Esau had gone out and he was hunting, and he comes back and he's hungry. He hadn't had any success. He's starving. He's just trotting around. I'm so hungry. Well, Jacob is sitting there cooking a big old pot of stew, and he smells it. And it's like that cartoon, right? When the cartoons, they smell something, they just like kind of float. He follows the smell. And he comes up to Jacob and he goes, "Jacob, I'm starving. I'm about to die. Let me have some of that stew." And Jacob goes, "I'll give you some, but you have to sell me your birthright." Now, for us, that may not seem like a big deal. For us, that may not seem like a big thing, but to them, this was huge. The birthright was so important. The birthright was given to the firstborn. Now remember, these are twins. They're minutes apart, but Esau came out first. So he was the firstborn, and he deserved the birthright. The birthright was given to the oldest, in which he would inherit a double portion of his father's possessions. So all of the kids would get something from dad, but the oldest would get the double portion of it, right? And this was very important because something else came with the birthright. Along with the birthright came this thing called a blessing. And the blessing was given to the one who holds the birthright. That was their right, because the blessing was given to them so that they would have prosperity in anything that they put their hand on. Anything that they did, they would be blessed to be successful. And the real reason behind that was because the firstborn would take over the role as the head of the household when the father passed away or got too old to go on. So he got double the blessing so that he could provide for the family, or double the birthright, or double the inheritance, and he got the blessing to be successful and make sure that the family line continued on. So this was something that was very important. However, Esau didn't think it mattered. He decided, you know what? One bowl of stew on a day that I'm starving to death is worth my birthright. And he sells his birthright for a bowl of stew. Idiot. But that's what he did. That's what he did. He sold it. And so, Jacob and Esau continue to grow. Jacob now has purchased the birthright. They continue to grow, they get older, and we get to chapter 27. And in chapter 27, we find that Isaac has gotten old. He's blind, he can't see, he mainly stays in his tent, all right? And he thinks the end of his life is coming soon. It's not, but he thinks it is. And so he brings Esau into the tent, all right? And he says, "Son, I want you to go out on a hunt. I want you to kill wild game. I want you to bring it back, prepare a meal for me. I will eat it and I will bless you." And Esau gets excited and he takes off and goes on a hunt. Well, little did they know that Rebekah, the wife, she saw what was happening. And she snuck up outside the tent and she began to eavesdrop, and she heard what was going to happen. And she said, "Nuh-uh, my boy's getting that blessing." So she runs and she finds Jacob. She comes up to him and she says, "Jacob, I want you to go get 2 goats. I want you to bring those goats to me, and I'm going to cook your dad his favorite meal. It's going to be great. And you're going to take it in and you're going to give it to him. You're going to claim to be Esau and you're going to get the blessing." And he goes, "But Mom, I'm not, like, Esau's super hairy. Dad's going to know if he touches my show." "Don't worry. This is how hairy the dude is. We're going to take the goat skin and put it on your arms and the back of your neck." That's crazy. That's a lot of hair, all right? And so he goes, "Okay." But then he begins to think and worry about the 11th commandment. Does anybody know the 11th commandment? Anybody? Most of us can probably quote the 10 commandments. Does anybody know the long lost, forgotten 11th commandment that's probably the most important commandment out there? The 11th commandment is this: "Thou shalt not get caught." All right? And so he's worried about getting caught. And he asks his mom, he goes, hey, what happens if we get caught? And she says, don't worry. If we get caught, the curse will come upon me. By the way, that's not really the 11th commandment. It's supposed to be a joke. Didn't work. Don't worry about it. All right? But she says the curse will become upon me. So Jacob agrees, and we pick up the story in verse 14. I'm going to read verse 14 through 26, I think. So he went and he got the goats, and he brought them to his mother, and his mother made the delicious food his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best clothes of her older son Esau, which were in the house, and had her younger son Jacob wear them. She put the skins of the goat on his hands and the smooth part of his neck. Then she added the delicious food and the bread she had made to her son Jacob. When he came in to his father, he said, "My father." And he answered, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" Jacob replied to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn, and I have done as you have told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game so that you may bless me." But Isaac said to his son, "How did you find it so quickly, my son?" Jacob replied, "Because the Lord your God made it happen for me." Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Please come closer so that I can touch you, my son. Are you really Esau or not?" Doubt begins to come in. So Jacob came a little bit closer to his father, and when he touched him, he said, "This is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau." And he did not recognize him, because his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esau. So he blessed him. And again he asked, "Are you really my son Esau?" And again Jacob replied, "I am." Then he said, "Bring it closer to me. Let me eat some of my son's game so that I can bless you." Jacob brought it closer to him. He ate it and brought him wine, and he drank. Then the father Isaac said to him, "Please come closer and kiss me, my son." So he came closer and he kissed him. And when Isaac smelled his clothes, he blessed him, and he said, and he gives the blessing. And he says in this blessing that you will have prosperity in everything you do. You will lead the family. Your brothers will bow down to you. Those who curse you will be cursed, and those who bless you will be blessed. And he gets the blessing, and he walks out of the tent. And no sooner did he walk out of the tent than Esau comes walking in. And Esau comes in and he goes, "Hey, Dad, here's the food. I'm ready for the blessing." And he goes, "What? Who are you?" And he says, "It's me, Esau, your firstborn." And it tells us that Isaac began to tremble and tremble uncontrollably. And he says, "Then who did I just bless?" Esau immediately realized what had gone on. And he began being frustrated and began to become upset. And he says, "My brother, he has deceived me twice. First with my birthright, now with the blessing." And he begins to weep and cry. And he asks his father, "Father, please bless me, please bless me, please bless me." And finally Isaac gives in, but the blessing that he gives him is not that fantastic. He says, "You're going to live by the sword. Your dwelling place will be away from the good land. You will serve your brother. You will, when you rebel, you will break his yoke from your neck." He gives him this very tough blessing. But he blesses him. Esau begins to stew and becomes so angry that he plans and plots to kill his brother when his father passes away. Well, word gets back to Rebekah, and she goes to Jacob and she says, "Son, you can't stay here. You need to go to my brother Laban and you need to find a wife." And Jacob goes, "Okay, yeah, I don't want to die. I will do that." And so they go to Isaac, and again, they trick him. They lie to him again, and they say, "Hey, Esau, he's married a couple of pagan women. I don't want that for Isaac. Can we send him to my brother so that he can marry somebody that is of the right line?" And Isaac agrees and says, "Yes, he can." And so Isaac, none the wiser, sends his son off, which in reality his son is leaving in fear and scared. And he goes off to meet his brother Laban. And so we see this family, this toxicness that's there, just continue to spiral out of control in just this web of lies. And it's a tough thing to see and watch. But I want us to look at the sin. I want us to look at the sin of the passage that we read tonight. But before we do, we have to ask the question, was it really just his sin? Was it really just Jacob? The title of tonight's sermon is Jacob, right? The fall of Jacob. What's going on here? What's happening? And what's really going on here is maybe he's just a victim of his own circumstances, all right? Maybe he's just, he was just following his mom's orders, right? No big deal. What happened? And I think that's a good question. I don't think it's right, but I think it's a good question. When we look at this family, there was tons of sin. Isaac himself, he rejected God's role and the will of God for his life. He rejected God's role for his life and God's will for his life and for his son's life. He created this feud between his family by picking favorites and allowing his wife to have favoritism over his sons, and there began this divide between this family. And instead of mending this relationship like my father did and setting things in the right place, he just divided it further and further. And many of us may say, well, maybe Rebekah never told him that the older will serve the younger. And that may be the case, but I'm sure she did, because as we can see, she was willing to do whatever it took to make sure her son was successful. Or maybe, even if that didn't happen, it's possible that he would have, or not possible, it was more than likely known that Esau had sold his birthright to Jacob, right? He had to know these things. And if he had the birthright, he couldn't bless Esau, but yet he surely went to bless Esau in place of all of these markers that said, don't bless Esau. And he continued to split the divide. I'm going to switch to the other one. Sorry, guys. So, that's Isaac. Now, Esau. Esau was full of sin. He had married pagan women like he was told not to. He had not cared to be a godly man. He wanted all the benefits of being a man that followed God, but he wasn't a man that was worthy of being blessed because of his sin and because of the evilness. I mean, he sold his birthright for a bowl of soup, all right? Twice the inheritance that his brother would get for a bowl of soup, all right? Idiot. And then, when he's faced with the consequences of his actions, he doesn't take responsibility for it. He goes, my crafty brother, he got me out. He got me twice, right? And he's frustrated at it. Rebekah, the mom, here she is getting involved in this sin. She's an eavesdropper, scheming against her husband. She had a lack of trust in her husband and only had the best interest of herself and her son before her. And rather than trusting that her husband would do the right thing, and maybe she was right because it didn't look like he was, she deceived him. But here's the other thing she did. She not only didn't have trust in her husband, but she didn't have trust in God to accomplish His will, to accomplish the promise that He had given her back in chapter 25. She lost it. And because of that, she deliberately deceived her husband. She cooked his favorite meal. She put the goat skin over her son to make sure that her son was taken care of. And then when we look at Rebekah, we see something that's going to cost her. In verse 13, when Jacob was thinking about, hey mom, what if we get caught? What did she say? Let the curse be upon me. She drug her son into her sin. She drug her son into the deception. And she said, don't worry, I'll take the consequences. Well, we're going to find out that she did take some consequences, but it didn't free Jacob from receiving the curse. Then we have Jacob. Jacob, just a victim of his circumstances, drugged to the sin by his mother, just following her orders. Surely he's innocent. Let's get a little bit of background on Jacob. Anybody know what the name Jacob means? Deceiver, right? Sorry if you're named Jacob. Don't mean to ruin that for you. It means deceiver or supplanter. Here's the thing. His sin was not that he stole the blessing. It was rightfully his. He purchased it with a bowl of soup, of all things. His sin was his lack of faith in God to accomplish the will of God without deceit. His sin was a web of tangled lies that he began to tell that grew and grew and grew and grew until he couldn't get out of it. His mother did not force him to sin. At any point, he could have said no. Yes, she brought him up to the line, to the edge of sin, but he had to step over and move forward. It was on him. He was the one that sinned. No one can make you sin. They can lead you up, they can bring you to temptation, but it is you who has to sin. At any point, he could have told his mom no. At any point, he could have said, no, Dad, I'm not Esau, I'm Jacob. I'm the one who deserves the birthright. We don't know what would have happened, but he could have done it that way and trusted God. But he didn't. Instead, he told 6 lies. He went and he lied about his name. Who are you? I'm Esau, your firstborn, right? Then he looks at him and he says, hey, I'm Esau, your firstborn. I've done exactly what you said. Did he do exactly what he said? No, he went and got 2 goats out back. He didn't even cook the meal. His mom did. So he lies twice. Then he goes in and he says, eat some of my game. Okay, game is a term for when you hunt and you kill an animal, you call it wild game. He didn't have wild game, he had goats. His mom must have been a good cook. If she could make goat meat taste like venison, that's pretty impressive. Just saying. Side note. Then he goes on and his dad goes, okay, how'd you catch the animal so fast? And what does he say? This is probably the biggest doozy of them all. The Lord your God made it happen. Brings God into it. All right? Then his dad asks him, are you sure you're Esau? I am, he says. Well, let me feel you. So he comes over and he feels him, right? Okay. Feels right. Sounds wrong, but he feels right. Then he brings him in closer. And he smells him, right? He smells him and he wore the right clothes so that he could deceive his father even more. But then, probably the biggest travesty, he betrays, seals it with what? A kiss. He kisses his father on the cheek in betrayal, lying to him. Jacob is the one who had entered into sin. Jacob is the one who was responsible for his actions. And here's the truth. We are responsible for our actions. We are responsible for our sin. And because of that, there are consequences that we will face. And we need to look at some of the consequences that this family and Jacob faced. The family, Isaac trembled with fear when he realized that God had flipped his plan upside down. Esau wept, not with repentance, but regret. He wanted, like I said earlier, he wanted to be a man that was blessed by God, but he didn't want to be a man that lived for God. He got so angry and so frustrated. He had already married 2 pagan women. He went and he found his uncle. Does anybody remember who his uncle is? No. Ishmael. And he married Ishmael's daughter. All right? Remember from last week? Abraham, Isaac. He's like, I'm going to put it to you guys. I'm going to go find the cursed son. I'm going to go get him, and I'm going to marry his daughter and bring her into the family. He was all upset. But then we get to Jacob. Jacob and Rebekah, kind of. What was the immediate consequence of his sin? His brother was going to kill him. So he had to run away. A homeboy, a mama's boy, had to leave his home and go to a place he had never been before when he had probably never strayed more than 100 yards from the house and his mom. And now he's on his own. He had to leave it all. And here's the deal. You remember that curse in verse 13 where she said, don't worry, my son, the curse will be upon me? When he left that camp that day, that was the last time he ever saw his mom. Mother's favorite was gone, and she would pass away before he would return. Now Isaac he thought he was on his deathbed. He'd live until he saw all of his grandkids from Jacob. He had 14 grandbabies from Jacob, and he got to see them all before he died. But the mom, the perpetrator, the one who dragged her son along in this, who had all these perfect schemes, she would never see her son again. Then as we continue with Jacob's story, we learn the hard lesson that what goes around comes around. All right? What goes around comes around. Jacob goes to his uncle Laban's house. He finds his cousin Rachel, and she is pretty. And he falls in love, and he goes to Laban and he says, I want to marry Rachel. What do I got to do? And they strike this bargain. If you work for me for 7 years, at the end of the 7 years, you can marry Rachel. So for 7 years, he works for his uncle Laban. He's very successful. Remember, he's got the blessing. He's very successful. He does great work for his uncle Laban, right? So there's finally time for this wedding ceremony. They have this great big wedding that's a week long. The bride, Rachel, is all dressed in this beautiful gown and has her face covered in a veil, which was tradition. They get together, they come, they consummate the marriage. They wake up the next morning. He pulls off the veil, and it's not Rachel. It's her older sister, Leah. And just like he used his father's blindness as a veil to trick him, Laban used the veil of the tradition and of the wedding garb to trick Jacob into marrying Rachel's older sister. Now, he would get to work another 7 years. He would marry Rachel soon after that, but work another 7 years for Laban and finally get the bride that he wanted. But let me tell you, if you thought his family was toxic, just wait, because it gets crazy. He loved Rachel so much, and he favored her so much that Leah felt left out, so God blessed her, and she had about 4 or 5 boys. Then Rachel, wanting to get more, gave her handmaiden to him to have children, and she had a couple of boys. Then Leah, seeing this going back and forth, gives Jacob her handmaiden, and he has a couple of more boys, right? Then finally, Rachel has a boy, and his name is Joseph. And so at this point, he's got 13 kids, 2 girls and 11 boys. I'm trying to keep all this straight in my head. I apologize if I mess it up. Go over, you can keep me accountable. Fact check me. All right? He's got 2 daughters and 11 sons at this point. And Jacob's the favorite. And he loves Jacob. He spoils him just like his mom spoiled him and like his dad spoiled his brother. And this begins to cause friction with the other 10 brothers. All right? He would have another brother. His name would be Benjamin. He'd be born later. Rachel would die giving birth to Benjamin. But they began to become jealous of Jacob. Joseph, thank you. Jacob's the dad. Of Jacob's favorite. There, I switched it. Of Joseph. They become jealous of Joseph, right? And they come up with this plan to kill him. They try to kill him, but Reuben, the oldest, says, man, we can't kill him. He's our dad's favorite. Let's figure out something. Throw him in a pit, and we'll leave him there, and we'll tell Dad that he got eaten by a wild animal. And his whole plan was to come back and rescue him from the pit. Well, he ran off to go get an animal, to slaughter it, to put on his coat with blood. And they sold him into slavery. And so just like Jacob used Esau's clothes, his sons would use Joseph's cloak, torn and ripped apart, covered in goat's blood, to tell him that his favorite son had been killed. Now, I could go on with the rest of the story, but we'd be all here all night and look at the miraculousness of God's will of Joseph being sold to Egypt, becoming the second high in command, and being able to rescue his family from a huge famine that comes up. But Jacob's sin followed him to the next generation. His fear of his brother lived in the back of his head for years until he finally had to face his brother. Now, God blessed it and they were able to come together and be unified. But that fear never went away. And this story of this toxic family ends with more toxicity. And it's heartbreaking to see. But here's what we can learn. Here's what we can pull out of this, our application for the night, and then we'll be done. The first thing is this: have faith in God's plan, not your own desires. We take this from Isaac, the father. He had desires for his son Esau. He disregarded God's plan that the older will serve the younger. He disregarded that his favorite son had sold his birthright. And he said, I've got my plans, I've got my purpose, heck with what God said. And it brought strife and trouble to his family. We need to have faith in God's plan, not our own desires. It's easy to follow our heart, and our culture tells us follow our heart. But guys, our heart can be deceitful. Our heart can lead us into trouble. We need to trust in God's plan. The second point of application we can learn from Sarah: have faith that God will provide. God had promised her something, right? And instead of waiting on His provision and His will to come and trusting that He would handle it, she began scheming and changing and making mistakes, drawing her son into sin. We need to wait and trust that God will provide for us no matter the circumstances that we're living in. That's what we have to do. The next thing that we learn is from Jacob. Stand up for you. Stand up for what you know is wrong. Stand up for what you know is right. If somebody comes to you and asks you to do something and you know deep down it's wrong, don't keep following it. Don't follow him off the bridge. I mean, this is his own mother, and he follows her off. He tries to stop a few times. At any point, he could have said, no, Dad, I'm sorry. But he didn't do it. Stand for what you believe in. Because if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. Some smart guy besides me said that. It just popped in my head a few moments ago. But if you don't stand for anything, you'll fall for everything. So stand for what you know to be true and what you know to be right. The last thing that I want us to pull from this and be able to use is probably the most important. God can use even our biggest mistake to accomplish His will. This blessing of Isaac that he gives in chapter 27 continues the promised seed that we see in Genesis chapter 3. The Jacob's scheme is another link in the chain from the promise that was given to Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, and then to his son Judah. You see, in chapter 12 of Genesis, we see that God promises Abraham that he will be the father of many nations, and out of that nation will come one that will bring about justice. He says, anybody that blesses you will be blessed, and anybody that curses you will be cursed. And we see in Genesis chapter 27 through 29 that the blessing that Isaac gives to Jacob is very similar. The smell of my son is like the smell of the field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you from the dew of the sky, from the richness of the land and abundance of the grain and new wine. May people serve you, and nations bow in worship of you. Be a master over your relatives. May your mother's son bow in worship to you. Those who curse you will be cursed, and those who bless you will be blessed. And then Jacob, as he grows older, he blesses Joseph's two sons who were Egyptian. And then he begins to bless all of his other sons. And in Genesis chapter 49, verse 8, I think I have it up on the board for you, he gets to Judah. And this is what he says. See if it sounds familiar to what we just read. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the necks of your enemy. Your father's sons will bow down to you. Judah is a young lion. My son, you return from the kill. He crouches. He lies down like a lion or a lioness. Who dares to rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until he who is right it is comes. And the obedience of the people belong to him. He ties his donkey to a vine and the colt to the choice vine. And he washes his clothes in wine and his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine and his teeth are whiter than milk. This scheme, this toxicity that was in this family, how deep and treacherous it was. In fact, it was Judah, as we learned a few weeks ago from Chris, that was the main one who wanted to kill Joseph. But yet it was all a link in God's perfect plan to bring about the Redeemer, the King. Verse 10, until he who right it is comes, the promised seed, that Redeemer, that King, the Messiah, the one that we know as Jesus, who left his throne in heaven, came down and was born a man on this earth, lived a perfect life to create righteousness for us, died as an innocent man on a cross, was buried to prove that he died, and rose again on the third day, defeating death. Showed himself to the multitudes and to many people to prove that he was who he said he was, and then he ascended to the right hand of God to be our advocate and to prepare a place for us. God used this toxic family that spanned generations to bring about his will. And all we have to do is believe in his son Jesus, this promised one, the one whose right it is. He came 2,000 years ago, and if we put our faith in him, we can be saved. No matter what you've done, no matter how toxic you have been, no matter how many lies you've webbed, no matter how many webs of lies you've weaved, God can still use you. And there's nothing that can change that. Will you trust in him and be used by him tonight? Let's bow together in prayer. Here in just a moment, Brandon is going to come and give us our announcements. But then after that, I'm going to invite you to do something. Myself, some of our other leaders will be up front. Macy and my wife Kate and Brandon and Corey and Joy will be around and be up in the front. And if you need to talk to somebody, we're going to be available. Maybe you need to make a decision tonight. Maybe you need to trust Jesus as your Savior. Maybe you've trusted Jesus as your Savior, but you've kind of gone astray. And you've wandered into some sin and you need forgiveness. Come and talk to us and we can help walk you through that. Or maybe tonight, life is just tough. You're frustrated. You don't know where to go. You don't know what to do, and you just need somebody to talk to, somebody to listen to you, somebody to give you a hug, maybe give you a few words of guidance. We will be up here to help you with that. But you've got to come to us. You've got to come to the feet of Jesus.